I just knew that I was an unhappy kid. And if I had to pick one word to characterize most of my life for the first maybe quarter century, I'd say that word was fear. I was afraid always. In terms of how I grew, how I healed, I had a supervisor when I was a master's student and I was learning to be a counselor who told me he didn't believe in the idea of closure. He didn't think there was a such thing as closure, because what he felt like was that closure was an idea that we were, as humans, always approaching, but never achieving. Because your history stays the same, your history remains unchanged. But every time you start to approach some sort of closure with it, you change. And now your relationship to it is different. I described it as a spiral staircase, right? And it's like I'm revolving around the same issues, the same loss of my mother, the same sort of violence growing up. And at each level, I have a new perspective on it because I'm further from it and it's different. But as I come around, it's like, oh, it's that same thing again. Look, kids, Big Ben, Parliament, And I would say that that healing is an ongoing process forever. But, I'm also far from where I started.
EQ Gangsters, what is going on? So I am here with none other than Dr. Jerry Novack, who so by day is Bruce Banner or Bruce Wayne, and then by night he is a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu who just crushes me on mat. So thankfully he has emotional intelligence, so he doesn't completely destroy me and my emotional health and intelligence while he's like just destroying me. But super incredible guy, and he has been a practicing therapist for over for a decade and some change. I'm going to have him going through his background and stuff, but I just want those of you all that are either watching us on YouTube at EQ Gangster or listening to our podcast, thank you so much. Again, thank you for rating, reviewing, sharing, subscribing. If you know other folks that are into jiu-jitsu, or if you know other folks that are maybe going through some tough times, hopefully we're going to talk about some things tonight, some practical application things, not only some deep insights that I've gotten from our most recent conversation just a week or two ago at a taco shop. But also, he's going to, share some amazing insights too. So not only is it going to be some great insights, but also some practical application. So Jerry, thank you so much. Oh, and Jerry has his own podcast. So definitely check out his podcast and website when you guys get an opportunity. Growing and Thriving. Is that
The Growth and Thriving podcast.
The Growth and Thriving podcast. The Growth and Thriving podcast. I'll make sure to put the different links and stuff in the show notes. But definitely check out Jerry's content. He's again got some amazing insights. We had a great conversation when we spoke recently, and I'm really looking forward to gleaning and learning more from Jerry, not only on the mats at jiu-jitsu, but also from his years of application and applying these principles himself. So Jerry, without further ado, brother, thank you for joining the EQ Gangster podcast, brother.
You bet, Noble. You bet. I joined the podcast. I subscribe to the podcast. I'm on the wait list for the EQ Mafia, so I'm all in.
Awesome. And also Jerry is going to be putting out at least one course, but a lot of great content and resources and products that you guys will also be able to access as he continues to build out his platform and content and stuff as well. So Jerry, can you share with us your background? Tell us about yourself. How did you, maybe a little bit about your childhood, if you're willing to go back that far, and kind of what has been the trajectory of your life and some of those experiences along the way.
All right. Mine is probably not the path to follow if you want to be a PhD in psychology. I fell really ass backward into it and by no means streamlined it. I mean, I finished school, got my doctorate when I was 39. So I grew up, I was born in dirty Jersey, New Jersey boy. I would not characterize my childhood as a particularly happy one. My mom got sick when I was 4. She was sick for the next couple of years, died when I was 7. My dad had kind of a temper problem and was prone to violence. And so that started my earliest memories, 3, 4 years old. After my mom died, I mean, there was a lot of chaos with that, a lot of running back and forth to hospitals for 3 years and sort of like emergency rooms. And after she died, my sister and I stayed with my aunt, with my dad's sister for a little while he kind of regrouped. About a year after my mother died, my dad remarried to a woman who was just awful. I mean, in retrospect and with some of my education now, I think it's pretty clear that she was not well. And so I can have a little bit of empathy, but man, she was verbally and physically brutal and violent and terrible to him, maxed out his credit cards and put him into bankruptcy and was terrible to me. She had 2 children of her own, a daughter who was quite a bit older than us. I didn't see her much, but her son was like 2 years older than me. And so we shared a room. He was my older brother, and he was also sort of a ne'er-do-well, constantly in trouble. I haven't seen him in a long time. The last thing I heard about him was he got caught cheating on the SATs when he was in high school. And so, yeah, he was pretty violent toward me too. What would happen a lot was he and his buddies would go out and get in a lot of trouble. I was sort of the tag along, the little brother. I never quite had the guts to do what they were doing, whatever it was. So I was always the lookout and I sucked at it because we always got caught, You know, he would sort of like, we get into the bedroom and he'd sort of like beat me up and say, you know, don't you tell on me kind of thing. And his mother would usually blame me for getting him in trouble and catch a beating that way. And then my dad would get home and she'd tell him what I was up to. And after about 4 years, he divorced her. And we were a threesome again, my sister, my dad, and I, for about a year. And then got remarried again. Still married to that woman now, like, I guess it's 30 years later, 31 years later. But, you know, I ended up like 12 years of grade school. I ended up in 9 different schools and I hated school. I was a terrible student. Barely got through, C, D, and F student. Went to college only because I was threatened with being disowned. I really did not want to go to college. So I went to college, majored in marketing, public relations, studied music as well. I mean, I graduated, but just barely. College was socially very good for me. I was not living at home and I was able to, you know, for the first time in my life, I didn't live in a constant state of fear. And so I grew a lot socially. I was really an awkward, strange kid up until that point. I had a hard time socially. I knew lots of people like in high school, but I didn't have any close friends. I never was invited to a party or a dance or anything. You know, my brothers and sisters all did that. I was never into any of that. So college, socially, I grew, but academically, not really. I barely got through. Got out of college, worked in corporate public relations for a little while. Worked for like a snack food company down in South Jersey. Worked for a law firm in Center City, Philadelphia. I worked for the Subaru Corporation. Their headquarters is in South Jersey, in Cherry Hill. But I just didn't love corporate life. I didn't like cubicle and suit and tie, and wasn't for me. I mean, PR was okay. Public relations and marketing was okay, but all of the like firms that you could work at were in Manhattan. And I just couldn't afford to live in Manhattan or to get there, and couldn't figure out how to manage that. And so the jobs that were available to me were all corporate, and it just wasn't me. So I ended up becoming a personal trainer. And I started, you know, just working at a gym, checking people in, but then gradually became a personal trainer. And I loved it. It was great. I ended up working for New York sports clubs. I achieved the level of master trainer for New York sports clubs. Eventually, I became a fitness team manager at 2 different locations. And I had great success. I made really good money. New York Sports Club, at least back then, was the kind of company where if you were bringing money in, they left you alone. So I made my own schedule, took off whenever I wanted off. As long as I was producing, they didn't watch me too closely. I was successful as a manager. I did really well as a manager, honed some leadership skills, made some mistakes, screwed some things up, but learned some lessons. And eventually I got to a point where I was working primarily with really high needs clients. So I was either working with elite athletes. I worked with some Division I competitors. I worked with some Olympians, just high level competitors, or I was working with severely infirmed people or elderly people. I worked with a guy who was recovering from a stroke. I worked with someone who had been crushed between two cars on the interstate and had a prosthetic leg and was learning to move again. Actually, one of my very interesting clients was, the actor Christopher Reeves. His mother was a client of mine. And at 74 years old, I trained her to race in the Head of the Charles in Massachusetts. Yeah.
No way.
East. Yeah.
That's amazing.
And so, so I sort of got to the point where, the average, soccer mom who wants to lose 5 pounds, I would refer to somebody else. I took the really high level kind of, but I had some clientele that I suspected that whatever was in the way of their goals wasn't physiological. It was emotional or sometimes interpersonal, family dynamics, things like that. And it frustrated me that I couldn't help them, and I wanted to be able to help them. So I spent a lot of time debating. I really hated school and did not want to go back, but I really did want to learn how to help these folks. So I graduated college in 95. This was either 2002 or 2003. I decided to just go back and take a class or two. And so I took 2 courses at a local college on counseling and family dynamics. And I don't know what happened, but I loved it. I got straight A's. I thought it was easy. For the first time in my life, I was one of the smart kids in class. Everybody wanted me in their group projects or their study groups. And so I finished that semester with A's in both courses. And it was so much fun, and I enjoyed it so much that I just took 2 more classes, and those went great, and that was awesome. And so when I got done with that, I took 2 more. And at the end of 6 years, I had a master's degree in counseling, and almost a near perfect GPA. It was like a 3.96. So it became almost a joke in my mind, like, what would happen if I applied for a PhD program, right? If there's anybody on planet Earth who should not be called doctor, it's this guy, no way. And so I applied for some doctoral programs, and I got some interviews. And so I started this game of chicken where it was like, well, if they're going to offer me an interview, I'm going to show up. And so I'd show up and do the interview. And then I got offered admission, and it was like, well, if they're going to admit me, then I'm going to go. And I'm just going to, I'm going to keep pushing until somebody pulls me aside and is like, don't you think this has gone a little too far? We both know you don't really belong here. It's time to go home. So in 2008, I packed my things and I moved from New Jersey to Indiana, and I started a doctoral program in psychology. My plan at the time, my great life plan, was that I was going to complete a PhD in psychology and then go back home to Jersey and go back to being a personal trainer. I was just doing it to see if I could. I had no real desire to be a psychologist, but halfway through that program, money got tight, and, doctoral school is expensive. I mean, even the books are just thousands of dollars a semester. And so I applied for a scholarship through the Air Force, and I received the scholarship. And so that paid for all of my tuition, and it paid a pretty nice stipend as well. But then after graduation, I owed them some time. So I commissioned as an officer in the Air Force and stayed an Air Force psychologist for a couple of years, seven years. I achieved the rank of major, had some leadership positions. I was a flight commander for a little while. I was mental health element chief, family advocacy element chief, director of psychological health for 2 different installations, and decided, I didn't love military service, didn't love the government side of it too much, wasn't really for me. So there were a lot of benefits to it. I'm glad I did it, but I just didn't want to stay for the rest of my career. So I got out in 2019 and bounced around a couple of jobs here and there, and eventually decided that I really prefer, I get very excited about working with like the thriving and excelling end of the performance continuum. I think there's great value in therapy, and I think helping people who are suffering is important work. There's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of managed care and insurance, and a lot of things that just, in my opinion, my view, are in the way of doing good treatment and good care. And so I feel like I can have greater impact helping people who may have had trauma histories or adversity in their past, but are doing okay now, are not in the throes of PTSD or something. I can help them to really achieve great things. And so that's what my business is about now, my podcast and my Facebook page and all that kind of thing. And here we are.
Wow. Amazing, Jerry. Thank you for sharing your story, and thanks for your vulnerability as well. Yeah. So I want to, one of the things that I share a lot on my podcast is that all of our emotional foundations are, get developed in childhood. Everybody, right? You can't not develop your emotional foundations, right, in childhood. So,
right.
So now with all this training, all this experience that you've got, with your master's or PhD, looking back at your own experience, a couple things, and obviously only answer whatever you feel comfortable answering. So don't feel obligated, if I ask something that you feel that you don't feel comfortable with. A couple questions. So now, as this PhD, as a psychologist, being able to look back at your own childhood, number one, emotionally, how were you impacted by all those very traumatic emotional injuries that you experienced in your childhood? Emotionally, what was that impact on you as a child? Yeah. And the reason I'm asking that is because rare is the child that has not experienced some sort of trauma. Rare, yeah. Right? So if you can kind of share, so that perspective, number one. Number two is, do you think you've healed? Or, from your childhood? Or is that an ongoing, kind of thing? So those would be a couple questions off the top.
So those are complex questions. I don't know that there's a simple answer to how was I impacted emotionally. I think human beings are complex. I do believe, I'm a big believer that nurture far outweighs nature. I don't think either one, I don't think it's an either or, right? Nature or nurture. I don't think it's an either or. I think that both matter, and that biologically we're born with certain tendencies or predispositions. And barring certain circumstances, some people are born with type 1 diabetes, or they're born with schizophrenia, or they're born with Down syndrome, right? Those are the exceptions. And to be clear, I'm of the belief as a psychologist, I believe that very few conditions or mental health diagnoses have anything to do with what's wrong with you. Yeah, we can find differences in the brain. There's differences in brain activity or brain structure or brain functioning, but our brains and our bodies respond to our environments. If you have an environment that's physically taxing, your muscles grow larger. If you have an environment that's abusive, your brain develops a certain way and your nervous system develops a certain way. If you have an environment that's loving and nurturing, you develop a certain way. And I would go so far to say that virtually every, at least mental health diagnosis we have, is more about what you've been through than what's wrong with you. And I would say even the conditions you're born with, like Down syndrome, are about what happened to you while you were developing in utero, more so than what's wrong with you. And so that's my perspective on things. And maybe it's because I'm a therapist and not a medication prescriber. So, I can't, if you're just biologically this way, there's not much I can do with you, for you. But if we can talk about what you've been through and how it impacts you. So the reason I say that I think nurture outweighs nature is because if you take a bunch of infants that are maybe an hour old and you put diapers on them so that you can't see their genitalia, aside from skin and hair color, they're very similar, right? They look similar. Their behaviors are fairly similar. There's very little variation from infant to infant when they're only an hour old. When you take that same group of infants and look at them when they're 40 years old, there's loads of variety, lots of difference in who they are. And some of that might be from genetics that got expressed later in life that weren't visible early on. But I think the overwhelming majority has to do with the environment and experiences they've had. And so that's why I say nurture outweighs nature. Generally, maybe not in 100% of cases, but generally. And so going back to me and how I was impacted, it's very easy to give you simple answers. I was a very angry kid. I was also, like most angry people, I was a very scared kid. There was, in my earliest developmental stages, there was not much in the way of security. There was violence from one parent and illness and death and what felt like abandonment through death from another. And so there was grief, and grief for a 7-year-old. I didn't have the capacity for grief. And so, I can sort of highlight those things and say, how I was this angry and messed up child. But I sincerely believe that the real answer is that all human beings are some combination of risk and protective factors. And some of those will be biological, right? Maybe I had some biological innate kind of resilience, but some of those were probably social too. Probably at every point in my life where I can highlight, my dad's second wife and how awful she was, or at that same point, there was probably also someone in my life who was a protective factor. And my first cousin, my first cousins and my aunt and uncle were very much that. They were very much a safe. Their house, I used to sleep over there every opportunity I could because it was a safe house, and they loved me and, took good care of me. And so that was a protective factor. I don't think I'm being dramatic when I can tell you that there were many times throughout my life where music saved my life. Anyone who knows me knows that I am an unusual music lover.
I know on Matt's, when we're rolling and the professor's got tunes playing, you're jump right in there with the tunes and stuff.
Yeah, it's true. But I listen on a really almost obsessive kind of level. I hear every nuance. I'm one of those guys. It drives people crazy because, like, people in my life, my partner, my kids, I'll be like, we'll be listening to a song and I'll be like, no, but I love this one little drum thing right there. And they're like, I didn't even hear it. I'm like, no, it's this tiny, and I'll rewind it. And, in 1984, 1985, we didn't have internet. We didn't have personal devices. We didn't have anything of that sort. And so I would, my environment felt so unsafe to me and was so unhappy, really, that I would sit in front of the family Wi-Fi, right? Or hi-fi. It was a hi-fi, right? The turntable with the cassette decks and whatever. And I had the headphones with the big spiraling cord and plug in. And I would literally vanish. Well, I guess not literally. I would figuratively vanish into those headphones, And when I was a kid, it was all the 80s hair metal. It was, Van Halen, Panama, and, Round and Round by Rat. And I would just, put that on, the old Iron Maiden, and just disappear into it. As I got older, I developed a love for hip hop, and then a love for jazz, and a love for classical music, even opera. There's very little music that I don't love and listen to like with my whole self deeply. And there are times when, honestly, I mean, I don't want to be dramatic, and I don't want to minimize or make light of a very serious topic. But, as a kid, I think there were times when music kept me from being suicidal.
Wow, sure.
Just kept me alive.
Sure. No, and that it makes sense to me. Being in such an unsafe environment, when you have an opportunity to, almost, like you said, not quite literally, but figuratively create another world of an avatar kind of, but auditorily just kind of escape. It was an escape. It was,
for sure.
It was an emotional, safety coping mechanism, I would imagine. And you just get, like you said, get lost, and really almost intentionally trying to get lost in this other environment that is safer than the other environment.
Yeah. And then, and then you can layer on that it was the 80s. And so there was, this still exists today, but it was to a much greater extent. Then there was, social rules about how boys were allowed to act or not, and what emotions were okay. And, in the 80s, if you did anything, even reasonable, if it was cold out and you wore a coat, your friends would call you a fag, right? Or whatever, which, now I don't care for, any terms like that, derogatory terms. But, back then we didn't even have the education about it that we have now. So the only thing a boy was allowed to feel really was you could be okay, right? Not even happy, really, just okay. Or you could be angry. And in my world, anything that made me visible, that made me notice, came with the threat of violence.
Wow.
So I became very good. Well, maybe not that good, but I tried to get good at disappearing, at being absent. I don't know what I would label that emotionally. I'm sure I probably met criteria for certain diagnoses for, depression or PTSD or things of that sort. I just knew that I was an unhappy kid. And if I had to pick one word to characterize most of my life for the first maybe quarter century, I'd say that word was fear. I was afraid always. In terms of how I grew, how I healed, I had a supervisor when I was a master's student and I was learning to be a counselor, who told me he didn't believe in the idea of closure. He didn't think there was a such thing as closure, because what he felt like was that closure was an idea that we were, as humans, always approaching, but never achieving. Because your history stays the same, your history remains unchanged. But every time you start to approach some sort of closure with it, you change. And now your relationship to it is different. On one episode in my podcast, I described it as a spiral staircase, right? And it's like I'm revolving around the same issues, the same loss of my mother, the same sort of violence growing up. And at each level, I have a new perspective on it because I'm further from it and it's different. But as I come around, it's like, oh, it's that same thing again. Look, kids, Big Ben, Parliament, And I would say that that healing is an ongoing process forever. But, I'm also far from where I started. When I was in my 20s, I got involved in a very high drama kind of a romantic relationship with a woman. We were arguing at some point in some very dramatic, tearful, impassioned, Oscar nomination kind of argument. And in the course of it, she referred to me as a tortured soul. And it was like you could hear the tire screech and the needle pull on the record player. Everything came to a halt in my mind. And I don't know why that phrase, but that phrase hit me as like, that's not who I want to be in the world, but she's not wrong. And so I started therapy, and I found a therapist who was really exceptionally good and really, really forced me to look deep in the mirror. Not forced, but sort of verbal jujitsu'd me, verbally judoed me into looking hard in the mirror, and made a lot of progress with her. I saw her for about 8 years. And then on and off over the last 20 some odd years, I've done different sorts of therapies with varying levels of success. I had good success with EMDR. That was helpful.
Can you just briefly explain what that is for folks listening?
Yes. So EMDR it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And the idea is that it used to be focused solely on eye movement. Your eyes would go back and forth. And the idea was that crossing the midline of the body while remembering your trauma would cause your brain to reprocess it. So trauma, like PTSD, is that set of symptoms occurs because a memory of a traumatic event, of a life-threatening or upsetting event, gets stuck midway through the memory making process, right? And it never gets, this is oversimplified, but it never gets filed away into that long-term storage. It stays up in the like, this just happened kind of memory, which is why people react the way they do. They feel like things that happened a long time ago are happening right now, right? If they had, let's say, combat trauma from a deployment to Iraq or something, and they're in Walmart and it starts to get crowded, their body reacts like they're in combat again. And so the idea was that this crossing the eyes of the center line would replicate what happens sort of during REM sleep, and it helps your brain process everything through the day. In more recent research, they've found that it doesn't have to be eye movement. Any sort of bilateral stimulation. So I like using buzzers in your left and right hand that kind of buzz back and forth. There's audio beeps that go back and forth. There's actually music you can buy for EMDR that you listen to in headphones, and embedded in the music is left and right stimulation. And so they find that helps with the processing of trauma. Yeah. So that was helpful for me, more so than a lot of other therapies. And most recently, I had a very profound experience on a guided psilocybin journey, where I went to some professional guides who really knew what they were doing, and took a very high dose of psychedelics, of psilocybin, and it just kicked the doors down of a lot of areas where I was stuck. And now I'm sort of considering what's next, right? Because all those things were progress, but I plan to keep growing.
So that's awesome, Jerry. So again, thank you for sharing that stuff. Man, and Jerry, dude, I'm sorry that you have been through so much, man, so much. I just cannot imagine. So, and thank you for, again, your transparency and sharing, and also, what a blessing that, you have, from an outsider, because, I don't know you super well, but from an outsider, it seems like you have taken ownership of your healing journey and grown and changing, right? I mean, is that fair to say?
Well, I like to think so. I think probably the fairest thing to say is that I have moments where I'm better at that and moments where I'm not. And the more I progress, the more moments I have where I'm better at it.
That's an excellent.
Not always that way.
Yeah, sure. It's a great way to say it. I've had a therapist now for about, I don't remember, 4 or 5 months now through the VA. And man, there was, we had started talking about some stuff, and it opened up evidently a can of emotional worms. And I went through a pretty good depression for a couple months.
Yeah.
And it was almost like I had regressed to my pre-emotional growth journey. All the original or default patterns of emotional responses that I would do pre-emotional growth, I did again for 2 months straight. And I'm like, and it really upset me. Yeah. It pissed me off, because I'm like, dude, I've been on this journey for 4 years. And, and thank God I've made some great traction.
Yeah.
But it was like, I completely regressed, and I did all my stuff, right? My avoiding, my stuffing and avoiding, I did that whole deal, and stewing and brooding, all that stuff. And so, just to hear, because I think that's for a lot of people, Jerry, now being in the space now for 4 years, you've been in it obviously a lot longer than me. It just seems like so many people don't take ownership of, and not that I don't understand too, because I think for a lot, now some it may be, you may chalk it up to a lack of awareness. A lot of people don't have, self-awareness. But another chalk it up to would be, man, I know for me, dude, so number one is unknown for many people. Number two, again, for me, it was scary, bro. I don't know. It's like, hey, go roll with this purple belt, Jerry. No, but I don't know how to roll. Oh, that's okay. The only, and this is a cheesy quote, but
I don't know how to roll either. I just keep showing up. They promote you eventually.
No, you know how to roll, man. And so, but
I was in the waiting room once watching the kids class, and one of the moms asked me, do you do jujitsu too? And I said, well, I put on the pajamas and I kind of flop around on the mats a little bit. I'm not sure if you'd call that doing jujitsu or not.
Well, let's say this. Your flopping is way better than my flopping.
Fair, but not always. You catch me once in a while.
So it's like, because the world of emotions is very unknown. And how many of us are trained in this stuff, right? Hardly anybody, if you look at percentage wise. And so, and if the world of emotion, just using jujitsu as our mutual ground, so here's this world of jujitsu, this world of emotions, and you pick someone off the street. Hey, you've got to go through these doors and roll with all these emotions, roll with all these jujitsu guys. And let's see how it works out for you. Right? It's like you open the door, see all those emotions, those scary emotions, those scary purple belts and brown belts and black belts. Like, nope, I'm gonna keep.
But I'll tell you two things, No. The first is that first set of beatings when you walk through the doors of the jiu-jitsu school, and nobody avoids them, right? You roll in every class. So day one, you get your ass handed to you.
Right.
As uncomfortable and humiliating and humbling as that experience is, it is vital and necessary if you're to be a black belt someday. No one gets to purple belt or blue belt or brown belt or black belt without that first beating. So yes, it feels awful. And if you look at it in a vacuum, it's a terrible experience. If you back up and widen the lens, it's a necessary step to get to where you want to be. And what I would say to you about this depression you're talking about, because I heard you talk about it on this podcast. I listened to maybe not all of them, but quite a few of the episodes. And there was one episode, I think it sounded like maybe you were in your car or something, but you were talking about this and this regression and this setback. And on this journey of growing emotionally, of working through past trauma or adversity, right? Not all adversity is trauma, but working through whatever it is we've been through, there's no such thing as regression. Your behaviors regressed. The behaviors went back to old patterns of responding. But if you imagine the spiral staircase again, what happened was you were making some progress and you come around the bend, and whatever it is that you're forever circling at the bottom of the staircase, caught you in a new way or in a way you didn't expect, or maybe it was a familiar way, but your resilience was worn down from other things, right? And your ability to, and so, yes, your behaviors regressed and you fell back into some old patterns. But again, if you step far enough back on the path, it's still, now that the couple of months is over and you're through that, you have new awareness about it that you couldn't possibly have had 3 years ago. 3.5 years ago. You have a new understanding of it and how to pull yourself out of it. And by the way, even though you have new understanding of how to pull yourself out of it, I guarantee you'll find yourself in it again at some point.
Right.
If you live long enough, you will.
Absolutely.
And that's not regression. That's forward progress. Forward progress is about continuously. It's like if you play any of those old school video games, right? At each level on a video game, you get to a harder boss. Right. And you have to beat that harder boss to get to the next level. And then there's a harder boss and you have to beat that harder boss. And this emotional stuff is like that, right? The things, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, everything set you off.
Right.
Now, every couple of years, you get blindsided by something. That's not regression. That's forward progress. It's just that the behaviors look like regression.
Wow, man, that's huge, Jerry. I appreciate that perspective. In another way, again, using jiu-jitsu as an analogy. So I've been doing jits for 4 years. And even if I got, say in class today, even if I got tapped out 3 times today, it doesn't mean that I necessarily regressed because I still have 4 years under my belt. It's not like I went backwards and forgot all my stuff. I just got tapped out 3 times today or whatever. You know what I mean? So that's a great.
I've been getting tapped out a ton lately because I roll with big monsters like you. And instead of starting on my knees or starting on my feet, I've been starting in side controller with you on my back, or I've been starting in terrible positions, trying to work my way out of them. So I get tapped tons,
Got it. Yep. That's great. That's great. And again, I love that it's not like you've regressed. I love that staircase analogy. You're just, in your jiu-jitsu journey, you were just walking around on that staircase. You're in a different part of that staircase.
Well, I can tell you what the staircase is for me in jiu-jitsu, right? I could probably tell you in other areas of life too. But in jiu-jitsu, so I have a little bit of a judo game and I'm a big dude. So I like to be on top and I hate to play guard, hate to play on bottom. I don't pull guard. And because I have this little bit of a judo game, it's not much, but it's enough that I usually can score the takedown from the feet on most people. And then I'm on top. And so my first several laps around, and so my skill level on my back in guard is terrible. And my ability for escaping side control is terrible. It is not purple belt level. And so my first several laps around that staircase were all about avoiding those positions, learning to stay on top, right? And now I've gotten to the point where, yeah, there's people who can demolish me, don't get me wrong, but most people at my level or below, I can manage to get on top. I'd even rather be inside somebody's guard, right? Because I'm a pretty good guard passer. And so I learned my first several rounds around that stairwell were about avoiding the demon of being on my back. Right. Now I've gotten to a point where I need to confront that demon if I'm going to progress. And so it feels like my jujitsu is getting worse because I'm tapping a ton, but I'm tapping a ton because it's no longer avoiding that demon. I already have the skill set to avoid it to some degree, right? Not to a black belt degree, but to some degree, I have the ability to stay on top if I want to. And now I'm forcing myself not to.
Got it.
And so it feels like a regression, right? But it's a regression because I'm progressing into doing what I'm really bad at.
Yes, that's excellent. Excellent perspective. And that's super helpful. And I think for a lot of people, I'm working on a book and one of the principles that I'm going to be talking about in the book is, and it's funny because I just struggled with this and totally forgot about all this stuff. So I'm like the number one hypocrite guy, is 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward is part of the journey, right? It's like, you can't do jujitsu. Like there is nobody in the history of jiu-jitsu. Now I'm only 4 years deep into it, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say there's nobody in the history of jiu-jitsu, of the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that have done jiu-jitsu, that have never been tapped. There's nobody in the history of jiu-jitsu that has right. And so it's like your emotional growth journey. There's no such thing as, like, one of the things I tell people that have never started their emotional growth journey before is like, look, man, this is not rainbows and unicorns. Now, it's going to be amazing on the other side, but the journey through it is, like you said, that and you said it was the first day on your mats. The first 2 or 3 years on the mats for me is humbling, and can be scary and potentially stressful and all these different things. But the value and the growth when you face and confront and go and grow through some of those emotional jiu-jitsu upper belts, is so freeing and rewarding and healthy and productive and valuable and informative, right? So many benefits. But when you're a white belt looking at you across the mat, like, oh man, this is not going to be a fun experience. But what's cool is, and you're another great example, because there hasn't been a time where I've rolled with you where you haven't coached me. So not only are you, can you crush me and are you, tearing me up, but in the process of you tearing me up, you're like, okay, look, don't do that. Try to put your hips here, or, put your hands here, or adjust your angle this way. And, so you're like, I feel like when I roll with you, I get beat, but I'm learning, right? There's some people where I just get destroyed. And like what just happened to me, but, with you, it's I get beat, but I learn because you're coaching me. And I think that can very much be somebody's emotional growth journey, right, if they're willing to go at it with the right perspective, and rather than be like, oh crap, I don't want to go through this experience. It's like, no, man, like what is the word is like, the analogy, like, who can I be, or what am I really capable of on the other side of this role with Jerry? Like, man, how much better at jiu-jitsu am I going to be after rolling with him? Even though I know it's going to be rough and he's going to beat me, but man, what is he going to teach me? What can I learn? How is he going to improve my game, right? And if folks can kind of have that learning growth mindset when they're facing their emotional growth journey, I just think that, man, there's so much freedom and healing and freedom, I guess, is the thing on the other side, if folks are willing to go through that. You know what I mean?
You reminded me of two of my favorite quotes. I love great quotes. There's so many brilliant people who have said things so much better than I ever will. And so Winston Churchill said, if you're not failing regularly, you're not accomplishing much. The other one is a jiu-jitsu quote. I think it was Renzo Gracie, who said, your opponent is your teacher. Your ego is your enemy.
Wow. Can you say that last one again?
Yeah. Your opponent is your teacher. Your ego is your enemy.
Man, that is so powerful.
Yeah.
In a lot of the jits gyms I've seen, check your ego at the door, because what's neat is,
if you don't, it gets checked for you.
That's right. Regardless, man, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, it is such a transformative process and journey. And that's how I look at, again, my emotional growth journey is, it's hard and it's tough and it's challenging and it's difficult and it's frustrating and it's exhausting and all those maybe unpleasant things, but it is like, here's a perfect example, Jerry. Like, I had no idea 2 years into my emotional growth journey, all these different areas of my life started to change. My faith, my parenting, my marriage, my finances, my business, my health and fitness, like all. And I'm like, are you joking? Like, all of these things were somehow attached to my emotions and emotional dysfunction, right? I had no idea that so many of why I was limited in my life, the governor on my engine, what was my emotional
Well,
impurity.
I don't know if they were the governor per se. I take a perspective, and I do this with my coaching clients because that's, I have a coaching practice where I work mostly with people who have overcome trauma and adversity and help them achieve their personal and professional goals, and fitness goals too. I'm still a personal trainer, so I deal with that too. But the way I look at it, the perspective that I take, that I think it's hubris to say like, oh, here's the truth, like with a capital T. This is just the perspective that, human beings are complex, and all of the factors and variables that make us who we are is very complex. And so I think you need some sort of parsimonious framework to start from. And so this is the perspective that works for me. I look at people as a collection of systems. There's an immune system, there's a digestive system, there's a muscular skeletal system, there's a nervous system, there's a cardiorespiratory system, there's what I call a cognitive emotional system. So there's all these systems. There's kinetic systems, right? There's an anterior kinetic chain and a posterior kinetic chain. And the more optimally all of those systems work, the better the organism functions in the world. And so if one of those systems is greatly compromised, right? Here's the thing, Noble, if it wasn't your emotional system that was compromised, let's say it was your immune system, you'd still be struggling in a whole bunch of areas. The issue isn't that one governs all the rest, at least not in my perspective. And I don't know, maybe there's research that I'm not aware of, or people who know things more than I mean, certainly you can make an argument that the heart and the brain are the governors, because if either one of those goes offline, you die, right? But generally speaking, I just take the perspective of like the more systems that function well, the better the organism's functions. And so the emotions and cognitions and what goes on in the mind is one of those systems. And it's no less important than any of the others, but maybe also no more important.
Oh, that's great. I have to chew on that. I mean, that's great. That's a great way to, because I mean, it's true. We are a collection of systems. There's no doubt about that.
There's social systems, right? Family systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, you're right. Let me just go back through. I was typing my, the notes as you were talking there. So immune, digestive, muscular, and I mean, they each one of those affects the other ones. There's no doubt about it. If your back goes out, so skeletal, guess what? That's going to impact a number of the other ones. Digestive.
And I got news for you. Overwhelmingly, not 100%, but overwhelmingly, when somebody's back goes out, it's muscular, not skeletal. Oh. It's usually soft tissue that's pulling the structure out of alignment.
Interesting.
Right? So, okay. I mean, the example I would give people, because I had one of the ways I sort of made a name as a personal trainer was I had a couple of clients who were scheduled for back surgery, herniated discs and the whole, and I'm not downing or putting down the medical system. Some people need surgery, right? It's the right tool for some people. However, I managed to have a couple of people where when we got the soft tissue in alignment and working right, the back problems went away. We sit a lot as a culture. And what most people don't realize, for example, is the psoas muscle in our hips. Actually, that hip flexor muscle, the psoas, it runs through your hip bone and it attaches to your bottom three vertebrae. So if your hip muscles are tight, that muscle is going to pull the backs of your vertebrae together and the disc is going to herniate out the front. So a lot of times loosening up the hip muscles fixes the herniated disc. Another example I can give you is if you were to stand up right now and we were to start tying knots in the bottom of your pants, those knots would eventually pull down on the waistband. I can't tell you how many people I've seen have great relief from back pain by foam rolling their calves. And I'm not saying these are magic cures, right? I don't want listeners or anybody to just go and arbitrarily say, oh, I have the, it's best to go to a professional who's knowledgeable and get an assessment and see really what's going on. And I think if you go to a knowledgeable fitness professional or kinesiologist, somebody who's good with movement, and they can do a movement screening on you, even if you have problems like herniated discs or knee issues or whatever, a movement screen can be performed very safely and not cause any damage. So I don't want to encourage people to haphazardly get into a fitness practice. I'm just using examples, right? And so in these issues, the systems are so intimately related that the structural issue, like a back problem, it could be structural. You could be born with terrible scoliosis or something, but in all likelihood, for most people, it's the soft tissue who over years of sitting or overuse in some way has pulled the structure out of alignment.
No, that's great. That's great. And even tying that back to emotions, it's so funny how we can address the behavior, but not the emotion behind that behavior. It's, so to your point here, you may think that, your spine, the skeletal structure is off, but in your example here, it could also be, the psoas muscle or the different things like you were saying.
Yeah.
And so it's, it's important to really do that deep dive to figure out what's actually going on. You know what I mean? In all those systems that you mentioned.
And it doesn't have to be abstract. I mean, when your back's acting up, Noble, how's your irritability?
Oh yeah. Oh,
right? Your emotions react to, they're very closely, same thing with digestive system, right? The gut is referred to as the second brain. The vagus nerve connects the brain and the gut. And so what we eat affects our mood and our emotions. How we digest, if you get stressed out and due to stress have some digestive issues, that affects your emotions. That's cyclical. Your emotions, your stress is affecting your digestion. And now the digestive issues are affecting, creating anxiety or depression or whatever the case may be. So the idea that these systems are intimately related is not abstract. It's not a stretch. What is a little bit of a stretch is that or maybe not a stretch, but for me, my approach of dealing with a human being is trying to understand how all the systems are functioning. That may not be the approach for everyone. I'm not saying that there's one right approach, but even if it's not your approach, which is fine, there's lots of people who do great work with different approaches. I think most people would have to admit that these systems have very intimate relationships with one another.
Sure. Well, I tell you one, and you kind of hit on it there a little bit. So the therapist that I'm seeing, the therapist counselor lady, she, one of the things she talked to me about, I've had, trouble sleeping. I've had back issues because of my military. I had a real bad jump in the military, and I'm definitely paying for it. And she's like, dude, two things and she said, tell me if any of these things, you can relate with any of these things. She rattled off 15 to 20 different issues and things. I'm like, 100% of those things. She said, dude, chronic pain and sleep issues, hit all that stuff. Like all of those things that I just rattled off, Noble, are a result of poor sleeping stuff and chronic pain. And I was like, what in the world? Like, I had no idea. I didn't know how all these different systems are connected and related. I had no idea. But she's like, dude, just let's forget about the chronic pain. Let's just do sleep. She's like, if you wake up every day fatigued and you're operating at, say, 60%, there are consequences, right? There are consequences mentally, emotionally, physically, right?
Yep.
And so now drag that 60% out over day after day after day, and that 60% may drop to 50%, may drop to 40%, right? And there can be a compounding effect on some of this stuff. And so, that's an excellent point.
I'll do you one better. Any of the benefits. Let's just talk about fitness for a minute. Let's keep it physical. I think physical is easier for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. So going to the gym and working out does not make you stronger. It does not make you leaner. It does not make your muscles bigger. It does not make you faster. It does not make you, give you better endurance. None of those things happen from exercise. All of the benefits you get from the gym all occur during recovery. And so what we do in the gym is we provide an artificial stimulus from which to recover. But if we don't recover, we don't get any of the benefits. We just get injured. And so recovery doesn't always mean sleep and rest necessarily. It could mean nutrition. It could mean hydration. It could mean a lot of things. But all of the benefits, getting leaner, losing weight, being stronger, being faster, that all occurs during recovery. And I would say the same is true of a lot of the emotional work, right? The beat down, if you will, the trudging through, the looking in the mirror, the digging deep is necessary, but it's only necessary so that you can then recover.
Wow.
When you recover, that's where the resilience builds.
Wow.
If you don't recover, you're just punishing yourself.
Right. Well, and there is also there's also a physiological point where there's a point of no return, like where you're actually breaking your body down and you're injuring yourself. You know what I mean? If you don't allow yourself the recovery time, you know what I mean?
And right. And like I said, the recovery can mean different things. So I know of people who are great athletes who say no rest days, right? They train every day. However, they have their nutrition, their hydration, and their rest dialed in well enough that they can train every day and still recover. And maybe once a year they take a week off or something. But so what I like about that framework, and what I liked about it as a trainer, and I use it now as a coach too, not just for fitness ideas, but for life, is I never liked the idea of overtraining, right? People would talk about overtraining injuries, and the problem with overtraining is that there's only one solution, right? The solution is you have to train less. And if you're working with an Olympian, training less may not be an option. And so when you think about, instead of overtraining, if you frame it as under recovering,
wow,
now there can be more than one solution, right? Training less could be an answer. That's true. But adjusting your sleep could be an answer. Adjusting your nutrition could be an answer. Adjusting your hydration could be an answer, right? There's lots of things that could help you recover better without necessarily training less. And so I think the same applies in less physical endeavors, right? I think the same applies for emotional endeavors and for interpersonal endeavors and even for academic endeavors and things of that sort, right? I think, graduate school was hard, sure. But there had to be, studying is great, but you only digest the information when you're recovering. That's when it gets encoded into the memory, right? And so it's got to be built in there somewhere. And grad school is a good example of an academic environment where, I guess you could take a semester off, but you don't get to study less when you're in grad school. So you have to figure out how to recover more, right? You have to improve your efficiency. And so the principles, whether it's jujitsu or the gym or graduate school or emotional growth, the underlying principles, I think, are sort of the same or similar anyway. It's just the application of them that varies.
Man, love it, Jerry. Huge. So wrapping up here, any final quote or quotes or ideas, concepts, practices, exercises that you would want to share or leave with the audience in terms of, their emotional growth journey?
It's funny. I recorded an episode of my podcast earlier today. It was with another therapist. And she was asking me about like how I approach treatment, which I don't do treatment now, but how I would. And one of the things I said to her was, as a therapist specializing in work with trauma, I liked having a ton of tools. I was trained in all sorts of things. I was trained in EMDR. I was trained in cognitive processing therapy. I was trained in auricular acupuncture. I was trained in neurofeedback. I was trained in mindfulness and meditation. And the reason is because all of these things are effective at helping quiet the nervous system, that fight or flight response. And because I had so many tools, if I introduced one, and I had a client say to me, dude, there's no way I'm going to meditate. Sorry, I'm just not going to. Then I didn't have to then convince them that they should. I could just move to the next tool. Well, how about sit here and I put some needles in your ears and we do some acupuncture, right? Okay, cool. Boom, we got it, right? Or, okay, no meditation. Are you willing to go take a yoga class? Yoga is amazing for trauma. Sure, I'll take a yoga class. Great. I had a list in my desk of places that offered yoga for free for veterans. Boom, here you go. And so I liked having a lot of tools. So here's another area where my approach in therapy or in coaching is similar to my approach in jiu-jitsu. You've probably heard me say on the mats that it doesn't make sense to me to know a million techniques or to just drill technique by technique. It's like having a huge vocabulary, but not understanding sentence structure. I would rather have fewer techniques and understand the principles, the guiding principles. And so when it comes to emotional growth, when it comes to thriving and growing, especially after adversity and trauma, to me, the most powerful tool is the ability to really clearly create a sensory image, visual, auditory, tactile of what it is you want your life to look like on the day-to-day. Many of us get very caught up in what we don't want, and that's fine. But what you don't want is far from what you do want, right? You ever have that conversation? What do you want for dinner? Oh, I don't care anything. How about Chinese? Nope, don't want that. Okay, what do you want? Oh, I don't care anything. How about pizza? Nope, don't want that, right? It's very easy to know what you don't want. It's much harder to know what you do. And then once you know what you do want, and you don't have to have the whole picture complete, right? You don't have to be able to see the whole staircase in order to start taking the first couple of steps. But there's probably a dozen or more techniques or approaches to start you on that path. It's just about finding the ones that are a good fit for you. But to me, the real money is in the ability to define what it is you do want, not just what you don't want, and some method for gauging your progress. How are you going to measure it so that you know? Like, how are you going to measure your outcomes, Noble, so that if you feel like your behavior's regressed, you don't trick yourself into thinking there's a full-on regression, right? How can you measure it so you can still see the progress?
Yes. Jerry, man, that is money, bro. So many great concepts and thoughts, man. Totally appreciate your time. And I'd love to hear the audience, or again, whether you're on YouTube or you're on the podcast, I'd love for you guys to share what was one of your takeaways. Put it in, in the chat log of the YouTube channel, or if you rate and review the podcast, put in the review section, kind of maybe a thought from episode, put the episode number, and then, maybe one takeaway or two takeaways that you got from this episode. Love to hear from you. Jerry, how do we find you? How do we follow you? How do we find you? Tell us your different social media, the websites, tell us all that.
So my website for my business, for my coaching practice, is growthandthriving.com, all spelled out. One word, growthandthriving.com. And that's all spelled out. If you go on Facebook, the Facebook page is Growth and Thriving LLC, but it's not all spelled out. It's an ampersand, Growth and Thriving. We have two Facebook communities that are pretty active. One is Growth and Thriving After Trauma. There's a group you can join. The other is Thriving Fathers, Parenting After Trauma. I actually, when I went to grad school, I wrote my dissertation on fathering. So that's kind of an area of interest for me. The podcast is the Growth and Thriving Podcast, also with an ampersand. That's available on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, and on Apple Podcasts. It's also on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel, which is Growth and Thriving LLC. Please feel free. You can email me through the website. I'd love to hear questions, comments. Jump on the Facebook groups if you want and comment there. I know Noble's in my groups there. You can communicate that way, but I'd love to hear what folks have to say. I appreciate, people have a lot of ways they can spend an hour and a half of their time. So I'm very grateful for those who chose to spend it with you and I.
Yes, Jerry, likewise, man. And again, thank you for sharing your own personal story and your wisdom and experiences with us, your insights. I took a ton of notes tonight, and I'm really looking forward to kind of chewing on these and reflecting on these ideas and thoughts. And again, just appreciate your wisdom and your time also, Jerry. And I'm excited for your growth of all that you are putting together as well to add value to a community and honestly a globe that I think desperately needs the things that you're talking about, that we're talking about. I just think there's a lot of hurting people out there that I think God made us for such a time as this, right? To add value to people and impact in this way.
I think the pendulum is swinging such that we're starting to recognize the need for like big gorilla tattooed men doing this kind of work.
That's right.
This has historically been the domain of women. It's historically been, a feminized kind of a thing, therapy and emotions and so on and so forth. And so, and men who ventured into this, and I don't mean to stereotype or whatever, but were very historically considered kind of, either soft or just academic, right? Very theory minded. And so I think having, I'm a biker, right? I belong to a biker group. I ride with Bikers Against Child Abuse, right? BACA. I think having a biker, a tattooed big gorilla of a guy who's on the jiu-jitsu mat, who can talk in a relatively educated, but more importantly, comfortable way about emotions. I think the time is right for that. The world needs it. So I value what you do, Noble, and I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you all for listening or watching. And again, thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing, and sharing with folks that hopefully this will add value to as well. Have a great evening. And for those of you all that want to join our membership group, go to eqgangster.com/mafia. We're going to be opening that up soon and be a lot of great content on there as well. And again, Jerry, thank you so much for your time, brother. Really looking forward to sharing this with as many people as possible.